But we also know from flow state science that we all have the wiring for it. Flow does seem to happen universally, and most anybody can get into it. And most people can probably think of something that has put them into that state of mind. But for me, I was like, okay, not everyone is a painter. Not everyone is going to be at the driving range for 5 hours. But what most couples are doing is trying to have sex on a regular basis. Wouldn't it be great if we could find a way to get into flow with the thing that most of us are doing and want to enjoy more anyway?
We'll make it out and fall in love tonight.
Today on the podcast, we have Dr. Emily Jamea. She's the host of the Love and Libido podcast and author of the USA Today best-selling book, Anatomy of Desire, 5 Secrets to Create Connection and Cultivate Passion. Welcome, Emily. We're so happy you're here, and we are so excited to get into this.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm thrilled to be here with you today.
We would love it if you would talk a little bit about how this came into your field, what drew you to this kind of work, and just what you've been finding along the way.
Yeah, sure. So I was probably giving sex advice long before I was qualified to do so. And the reason for that is I grew up in a small conservative town. My dad was an OBGYN though. So in my household, sex was not taboo. It was something I, grew up hearing him talk about on the phone with his patients all the time. No big deal. My parents were just, I guess at that time, a bit more progressive. And I felt like I got great information and education. But as I entered into adolescence, it quickly became apparent that that was not the case for many of my peers. And so I think, and this was kind of you could Google anything, and I'm aging myself a little bit, but they would come to me for information. I mean, this was back in the day when you were lucky if you could check out that book at the library. Are you there, God? It's me, Margaret. No one was talking about this stuff. And so they started coming to me with questions and I would have the answers. And, so that's why I say kind of at a young age, it's just something I've always been comfortable discussing. Fast forward, I was studying psychology in my undergraduate program. I was at the University of Texas at Austin, and I took a human sexuality elective, not really knowing that that was an area of specialty within the field of psychology, and was quickly just so taken with, what I see as being a really interesting way into the psyche. I think that you can learn so much about a person by asking them questions about their sexuality and how they understand that part of themselves and how they express and experience that part of themselves. You can learn a lot about a person psychologically. So it was at that point that I kind of hit the ground running. And I think by the end of my time there, I had taken every sexuality course that the university offered, and, went on to grad school. And it's really felt like a calling for me. I think to be a part of helping people in this area of their lives and, kind of serving as a guide to help them reclaim something that to me is so beautiful and natural, but to so many people is ridden with taboo and shame. I just find this work really meaningful.
Thank you. And it's about 15 years that you've been doing that officially too. Do I have the time frame right?
Yeah. So I finished grad school in 2009, but of course you're doing internships and stuff leading up to that, as you know. So yeah, it's been over 15 years now. After I finished grad school, I moved back to Houston and hung up my shingle. And it was really interesting. Houston's a city of 4 million people. And at the time I started working, I was one of 3 certified sex therapists in the city. And so there was just a huge need for my services. Now it's, become a lot more popular, and thankfully we have a lot more people because we have a huge demand for it. It's interesting, Texas is very conservative, of course. So there's still that plays into, I think, the feelings that a lot of people here have around their sexuality. Houston as a city is a bit more liberal, but it's so international. In fact, it's more international than New York. So, I am working with people from all walks of life, from all over the world, many of whom came from very rigid cultural systems or religious backgrounds as it relates to their sexuality. And so it's just been a really interesting way, I think, in helping people who have such diverse backgrounds and who are bringing so many unique dynamics into my office.
Yes. So you mentioned you had a unique childhood with the fact that sex wasn't really taboo in your house, that even though it was a very conservative neighborhood, you had the ability to speak freely with it. It was spoken about regards into your house. And that is a unique experience. Not everybody has that.
No.
But still being indoctrinated with a very conservative area when everyone around you is in that space, there's beliefs that and experiences that come up in that space. So as you were comfortable speaking about it with your friends, and then you started to dive into these classes, what did you find about you? What parts of you did you find liberated or were able to really connect with on a level that maybe there just wasn't access to before?
It's a great question. And I don't know that that's one anyone's really asked me specifically. I think, you're right. As much as I felt comfortable talking about it, I think as it relates to sexuality, it's dynamic. I tell this to my clients, you can't ever go into it with like a set it and forget it mentality. And, I hear people referring to themselves as like an expert in sex. And I like shy away from that term because I just feel like there is always more to learn and understand. And I think it's like, as I kind of dove in to the study of sexology, I just had more questions, because I think apart from many aspects of our experience of being human, it is one that is just so profoundly influenced by so many different factors, whether it's our culture or our religion, our family of origin, our early childhood experiences, negative life experiences. I mean, the list goes on and on. There are individual elements, spiritual elements, relational elements, environmental elements. Like, it's just a very kind of fluid and dynamic element of our identity. And so I think as I was studying it, it was only then that I realized how much I didn't know about it. And I think that, in many ways is what has kept my work so interesting because, I could have 5 couples come into my office complaining of discrepancy and desire, but every case is so different and unique in its own way. It's not like I'm repairing a broken arm the same way. So I think that's what kind of keeps it interesting for me and, continuously draws me into more, research and understanding because it's changing all the time.
I wonder if you could speak, because we talk about it on the podcast sometimes when it comes to, we talk about trauma and healing and all sorts of stuff all the time, but it's always on this spectrum where it's never just one, like big T, little t trauma. It's always just this big, huge spectrum of experience that we all have and navigate. And over the last couple of years, we've been thinking about it from that perspective too, when it comes to sex and how a lot of times, because, growing up, I had a version of my childhood and my life and my experiences, and then get into therapy and understand things a little bit different. And then I can reflect back and see my whole experience, my whole childhood way, way different than I ever had before. And I think that when it comes to sex, this is my opinion, of course, but I want to get your take on it, is it's like everybody has some form of trauma when it comes to sex, if we look at it on that big spectrum, where sometimes it might not necessarily be some of the more traditional things that we think of when it comes to like sexual trauma or sexual abuse, but just itself is something that is so triggering and challenging for people to navigate, and they might not necessarily see their experiences through that lens. But I don't know if you could speak to how that might be helpful for them to kind of reframe it in such a way to understand where they've got some of those issues, maybe where originally they might have thought, oh, I don't have any problems, everything's fine, but yet when you start to reframe it and look at it through these different lenses, it's like, wait a minute, there's some issues there. So I'm just curious if you've had, I mean, I'm sure you've had that experience with the people that you work with, but if you could speak to that some more.
For sure. And I agree with you on the one hand that trauma exists on a spectrum. And of course, there's the obvious big T traumas. If I'm working with someone who's a survivor of sexual assault or abuse, like that's pretty big T trauma versus, when I'm working with someone who had attachment issues in their family of origin that contributed to their ability to maybe let go and surrender with another person in the bedroom. And then of course, working with people who have maybe spiritual abuse or trauma. Like I was working with someone not too long ago. It was a workshop that I was doing for a private group. And, she said that her whole life, she had been told the reason she didn't have orgasms with her partner vaginally, just from penetration, is because she had sinned. And I'm like, nope, it's because of your anatomy. Like, let's unpack that a little bit. So those kinds of things. Now, all that to be said, I think we've gotten a little too comfortable labeling everything as trauma. I don't think, I feel like on the internet these days and social media, it's like everyone is a narcissist, gaslighting, and has trauma. And I'm like, I just think those are pretty inflammatory terms. And so I like to be very careful when using them. I think there are a lot of people who maybe grew up with, let's say, less than nurturing environments, maybe around kind of fostering an understanding of sexuality. And a lot of time, as much as I can, I try to hold compassion. We just didn't know and understand as much, 20 years ago as we do today especially in terms of things like, sexual and gender fluidity. Like there just wasn't as much of an understanding for a long time. And so, I discourage, and it's like everyone's on their own path, but I hit the brakes a little bit when someone looks back and says, labels an experience like that as traumatic. Cause I'm like, let's also hold compassion for the fact that probably your family did the best that they could with the information that they had. And it was definitely suboptimal given your understanding of your sexuality today. But I think when we start labeling too many things as traumatic, it can almost inhibit our growth. It's like instead of maybe having one or two symptoms of trauma response, when we start labeling and viewing everything through a trauma lens, suddenly we have like 6 to 8 symptoms of a trauma response. And so I just think we have to be kind of careful with that word because, I find for some people it holds them back. Seeing it that way more than it does help them move forward. I see this a lot in, I just read an article about this and I had posted a blog to Psychology Today about this too. Like so many people cutting off adult children, like cutting off their parents because they've gone to therapy and like the therapist has told them, labeled all of these things their parents did as abusive. And I'm just like, so yes, and is what I would say when it comes to, fostering or kind of developing our understanding about the way our past has shaped us.
It's interesting. I have a slightly different point of view with that.
Okay. I would love to hear it.
I would love to share it. I love the way that you're looking at it and like not getting bogged down, because the truth is we do get quite attached to labels at times. And that can be something that when we find this label and then we're here, then that becomes our identity. And it can become very difficult to heal past that, to move past that, to release that. And I think that there's so much bypassing on what we feel and experience, especially if we're looking at these environments, even, the less than nurturing, because there's a lot of times we don't want to call things like, I'm not going to say neglect if you are, but there is the part of where we get dismissed a lot, and we were dismissed. And maybe that's showing up in our sexual relationship as we're not feeling comfortable to communicate things that we like, things that we don't like, feeling like our needs it's going to be dismissed. So when we're able to actually look at things on like a little bit of a deeper level and name them. Like this was a traumatic thing. I feel like from what I've experienced, that there's part of us that we can feel seen in that moment.
Mm-hmm.
And when we can feel seen at these parts that were so shunned and hid away, then it allows us the opportunity to then start unpacking. It's like, okay, what I'm feeling, I'm learning how to, it helps you build trust within yourself of what you were feeling was off, was in fact off. And
Sure.
when you start to make other choices, you're like, I can trust myself instead of feeling like, it wasn't that bad. It really wasn't that. So, and it's hard to trust yourself.
Yes.
Yeah.
And, I do a ton of that. I mean, exploration and understanding the links and identifying patterns is a huge part of my work. I just tend to, I avoid quickly jumping to labeling something because
today's episode is brought to you by Woolly. Most fabrics today are packed with synthetic materials, microplastics that shed into the environment and your skin.
But not Woolly clothes. All of their apparel is made with natural merino wool. And the very first time I tried Woolly, I was hooked. I swapped out all of my boxers, not just because they're comfortable and feel good, but I'm also concerned about not leaching any of those harmful chemicals you know where. I mean, come on.
Craig loves his boxers, and let me tell you, I can't get enough of their panties either. They're so soft and comfortable, it almost feels like I'm not wearing any underwear at all.
Merino wool isn't just soft and comfortable. It's naturally moisture wicking, helps regulate your temperature naturally, and odor resistant. So with temperatures heating up this summer, it's time to go with some Woolly.
And right now, listeners of Steph and Craig get 15% off of everything at Woolly. Click the link in the description. Be sure to enter promo code Steph and Craig and save your 15% now.
Wear better, feel better with Woolly clothing.
generally I feel like, sometimes a cigar is a cigar and we need to label it as a cigar. Other times it's just more complex and doesn't always fit into a specific label because you have to take into account, I think, the broader context around what happened. So that's sort of the way I approach it. I still definitely explore and, identify patterns and make those links because I agree. I think that helps really bring to light a clear understanding of why we respond the way we do.
I found myself like kind of stuck in excuses when I started reading your book. And you talk about the study that you did. And I love that it was like you have to be in a relationship for a year, at least a year, and you had to be 25 or older, and just like really setting the parameters to kind of avoid the new relationship energy where everything is very passionate a lot of times, right? Not always, but
right.
The standard usually is that's where you're in that really high charge sexual phase. You have all your chemicals that are firing off and having a great time. And so when I first saw that, I was like, a year and 25. Well, how does this I'm far from that. I'm about to be 45. I'm, experiencing perimenopause, and I'm in this state of life where my hormones are doing very different things in my body that I get to relearn. What's my body feel like now? And so I found myself being like, well, sure, if you're 25, but this isn't going to apply to me. That sure, if you're this, but this isn't going to. So I was already looking for excuses because I identified with the label. I'm perimenopausal, and I'm not dismissing that at all. But I was using it for an excuse of why, well, these probably wouldn't work. At the beginning of the book, before even like looking at some of these exercises. And so I caught that for a moment and I was like, let's get curious. Let's just get curious. Like, how do you know if these are going to fit into your space or not? And your very first study starts with a couple that was in their 40s. And it was like right out of the gate, you're like hitting it right in that phase. And it didn't have to have an identity without dismissing around why it couldn't. It's like, let's get curious with presence. Let's just start with presence. And that like just opened the journey for me of your book. And it was like, we're getting curious about presence. And I would love you to speak on that. I know flow is a really big part I want to hear.
Yeah.
But if you could speak to the importance of presence and just like how it shows up in our lives, how it shows up in the bedroom, and why you can't all of a sudden be like, okay, now I'm present with my partner in this space if you don't have a good hold on it.
Sure. So let me back up because I think I'm not sure if you may have misunderstood some of the parameters that I outlined in the beginning of my book. So this book was based on a research study I did. So just to kind of back up and explain how that came to be. So, I had reached a point in my career where I could help couples, minimize the discrepancy in desire. I could help women have orgasms, so on and so forth. But I'd get people coming back into my office, usually for their accountability session, saying things like, we're definitely better than we were when we started with you, but it's still missing that kind of higher level of intensity that we longed or that we experienced in the honeymoon phase. Or, we just want it to feel like it seems to be in the movies. And so I'd kind of explain the honeymoon phase. It's a temporary yet intoxicating neurochemical high designed for pair bonding, but it's not sustainable. Or, I'd give them my canned response about Hollywood sex, about how those are paid actors and there's a lot of rehearsal, multiple scenes, like the whole thing is fake. Don't compare yourself to that. But I also knew what they meant. And I started paying closer attention to the language my clients were using to describe the sex they wanted. Now, keep in mind, most of my clients were in their 30s, 40s, and 50s. I would say at that time, this was about, 7 years ago that I was really developing this. That represented my demographic. And so I knew what they meant. I started paying a closer attention to the words that they were using. Things like, I want to feel lost in the moment. I want the world around me to disappear. And I was like, oh, they're talking about a flow state. So for your listeners who don't know what a flow state is, it's a decades old term coined by an American-Hungarian psychologist named Mihai Csikszentmihalyi. And he observed that people enter into this almost altered state of consciousness when they are engaged in an activity that they find really enjoyable. So they experience things like dilution of time. It can feel like it speeds up or slowed down. There's a sense of effortless. There's a sense of unity, merger, or oneness. Think of like a surfer who's at one with the wave. And I was like, okay, yeah, flow. Like, of course, that's what people want to feel. And I was familiar with flow. I had read his book, but it's not a term I had ever really heard described in conjunction with great sex. So I turned to the literature to see what I could find because I am always an evidence-based practitioner. And there was nothing out there. There was not a single paper that looked at the relationship between flow state and great sex. And so I initiated my own research study. And I think that's where you were talking about the parameters. So people could only qualify for my study if they were over the age of 25, because I wanted to rule out that like young adult hormone driven sex. They could only qualify for my study if they had been in a relationship for over a year, because I wanted to rule out the easy neurochemical honeymoon stage sex. They also couldn't be pregnant or have a child under the age of 1, because as any parent out there knows, like that would have skewed my data because that throws a wrench into everything. And so I was particularly interested in what if people could experience flow during sex beyond the honeymoon phase, and if so, how they were doing that. So I got 100 participants. I administered a sexual satisfaction questionnaire and a flow state questionnaire, and found that yes, in support of my hypothesis, people who were scoring on the upper end of the sexual satisfaction questionnaire seemed to be experiencing a flow state. And not only that, being able to get into a state of flow was predictive of high satisfaction, which was really exciting to me because it meant by teaching people about flow and about flow state science and how to apply it to sex, I kind of had a new and interesting way of helping my clients who had low desire and satisfaction. And the other great thing about my data is I had a really nice distribution of people who had been in relationships, 5 to 10 years, 10 to 20 years, all the way up to, 40 plus years together. And also a really nice distribution in age. So, people who were in my study were in the perimenopausal period or beyond, so I had people, like I said, they had to be I think most of my research participants, they were all between like 25. I think the oldest one I had was like approaching 80 or something like that. But it was a pretty even distribution, which is just great from a research perspective. And so what I did then was I I called the people who had the highest scores and had really long conversations with them about how they sustained high satisfaction, and what that was like for them. And in those conversations, I learned about people having great sex despite chronic illness, despite chronic pain, despite having gone through relationship betrayal. These people had found their way back to each other in a very cool way. So that is what set the foundation for my book. I was not looking at like 25-year-olds by any means.
Thank you for clarifying that. I thought
Yeah.
it was funny how like I found that like at the beginning, it was like the book called out the beginning, because as soon as I saw, they had to at least be, it was the excuses that started in my brain of like, why this? I'm like, who's talking right now?
Sure.
Like, what if this is really, and you mentioned the flow state.
Mm-hmm.
There's so much like that. It really stood out to me because there's so much in the space right now. I feel like all my notebooks are find the flow, going with this flow, and the same. I have never heard it connected to a sexual experience. And so that was just like, what?
Yeah.
That opened up so many spaces of possibilities in that. And I started implementing.
I love framing it that way.
Yeah.
Because it's like really easy for me to think about us.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like time definitely disappears. Like everything suddenly becomes just this really connected moment where it feels like it's just the two of us. It's not all the time, right? But we have countless experiences where we've had those moments where it's just very much those, like literally everything disappears.
Mm-hmm.
It's nothing but the two of us. And it's so not just intense, but yeah, like I like framing it in that concept of flow. Cause I know what that flow state feels like in regards to other areas of my life and other things. And so same thing. I've never heard it, connected in that way. It's really, really awesome.
Well, there was nothing out there. It hadn't been connected in that way. I found one paper that looked at kind of a small sample size of BDSM practitioners who were getting into altered state of consciousness, which, I mean, frankly, we can learn a lot from that population about how to get into flow. If, you're not in the kink community, there's a lot that they do that helps them get into flow that I think any couple can do, even if you're not having kinky sex. But what I love about this is, I think historically when people think of the ability to get into a flow state, a lot of times the automatic assumption is that you are only going to get there if you're like really good at something. Like, you hear flow described in athletes or musicians or, surgeons who can, operate for 10 hours without stopping for a bathroom break because they're so hyper focused and in the zone. But we also know from flow state science that we all have the wiring for it. So flow does seem to happen universally, and most anybody can get into it. And most people can probably think of something that has put them into that state of mind. But for me, I was like, okay, not everyone is a painter. Not everyone is gonna, be at the driving range for 5 hours. But what most couples are doing is trying to have sex on a regular basis. Like, wouldn't it be great if we could find a way to get into flow with the thing that most of us are doing and want to enjoy more anyway? And so my hope was in part that this book kind of made flow state a bit more accessible to people.
Did you have a question, babe?
Well, I have so much to talk about. You go ahead. I can keep going.
One of the things that I've had to really unpack in our relationship and over the course of because we've been together for 13 years and we've had, our sexual relationship over that time period has been just this, roller coaster wouldn't even be an accurate description. It's just been this journey, right? And I've had to really
I love the reframe. Not a roller coaster, just a journey.
Been a journey for sure. I've had to really look at and recognize and learn how I will use sex as a coping mechanism for whatever else I'm feeling. So not just because a lot of my processing and understanding of my nervous system and healing and when I'm dysregulated and the things that I'll go to like food and some of the other addictions and substances and things like that. and never really having a real good understanding of how I would use. I mean, I might look at it. Let me slow down a little bit. Yes, I would see how I would use things like pornography for the coping mechanism aspect of it, but just the actual literal physical act with Stephanie, with my partner, that part of it was something that really took me a long time to like get not just curious about, but a really good, healthy understanding of it, where I would initiate or go towards it in a sense and try to, try to have sex because I was feeling something else underneath and dysregulated underneath. And I know that like for me, I was completely oblivious to it for a really long time. It was something that I had zero awareness of. And so I was hoping you could speak to how predominant maybe that is, how big of an issue that is, where people are using it unbeknownst to themselves to really regulate other things that are going on, and how that can cause some issues. Because I know that it did cause a bunch of issues for us in our relationship.
You bring up such a great point, and I have so many different things to say about it. So
today's episode of the podcast is brought to you by Routine.
We've been on the hunt for an electrolyte powder that we can add to our water every day, and we're excited to say we found it.
Morning Routine is a special blend of organic lemon, apple cider vinegar, Himalayan sea salt, and all the other essential electrolytes that you need for your day. It's non-GMO, organic, dairy and gluten-free,
soy-free, sugar-free, keto-friendly, 100% vegan, and made in the USA. And one of my favorite things about Routine is that it doesn't contain any synthetic dyes or preservatives.
You simply add water, shake it up, and enjoy the nutrients that your body needs for the day. We've been enjoying Routine for a while now and can't wait to share it with you.
Right now, listeners of the podcast can save 10% off anything at Routine. Head over to yourroutine.com/Steph and Craig and be sure to enter promo code Steph and Craig at checkout to save you your 10%.
Start your day off the right way with Morning Routine. Your body will thank you.
One, the first thing that comes to mind as I'm hearing you is the difference between finding a behavior to zone out and disconnect versus a behavior to zone in. And, because zoning out can make you feel like you're regulating the nervous system because you're breaking in sort of a kind of disembodied way, let's say, from whatever is causing stress in your life. And you get a nice little, mental reset. Let's say you're just, video gaming or watching porn or, whatever it may be, and you're sort of disconnected. That's zoning out type of self-soothing versus zoning in self-soothing, which can help regulate the nervous system, I think, in a more profound way, and rather being like purely kind of dopamine driven, help also with serotonin. And I can talk a little bit about the neurochemicals that are present in flow versus, let's say, honeymoon stage sex, because I think that's a really interesting conversation. But and this is actually a great example of what Stephanie and I were talking a little bit earlier about, like pathologizing or labeling. Like if you were to go to a therapist and say, I rely on sex to self-soothe, a lot of therapists might very quickly pathologize that as unhealthy and a symptom of having an anxious attachment, and, try to break you away from that. I would kind of do a bit of a deeper exploration, because I am of the mind that if it's coming from a place of being in the zone and connecting and grounding, and if you have other tools in your toolbox to self-soothe, that isn't in and of itself a bad thing. Now, if you solely rely on sex to regulate, to feel seen in your relationship, to feel validated, and that's the only tool that you have, then it becomes a very self-absorbed experience and not really one that connects you to your partner or deepens the relationship in a meaningful way. But let's say you've had a horrible day at work, you feel like you're falling apart. Like I interviewed someone, I think this story is in the book, whose twin sister died. And, she was totally dysregulated and grief stricken. I mean, it was like a part of her had died. This was her twin sister. And the comfort that she found from having sex with her husband. And this is something I have seen in my practice, where during really tough times, people will turn to sex to like soothe, but in a connected way, as opposed to this kind of disembodied zoning out, just going through the motions way. So there is a difference. Does that make sense?
It makes so much sense. And I'm glad that you frame it that way, and the difference between those two, because I can reflect back on moments when those exact things were happening. And I have because I've got sexual trauma in my past. So I have a lot of, it's a thing that's, I'm always like hypersensitive and hyper focused and trying to, it's a subject and a space for me that's really challenging and hard. So I'm always looking at it from kind of like I want it to be the healthiest version that it possibly can be, because it hasn't been over the course of my entire life.
Yeah.
But framing it that way suddenly just was like, oh yeah. Because it's not necessarily a bad thing if you're coming from that, the way that you just explained it. Because I can think of a lot of experiences where there's times where this is the other thing that was coming up for me too, is like how often over the course of our relationship where we would use it to solve fights, but it wasn't really solving fights. We were just simply using it to stop the fight in the moment. And then it never really solved any issue at all. Right. And we would, that pattern just kept happening over and over and over, where it was like, we would get into an argument, get into a fight, get really like wound up, both of us, nervous systems would be super dysregulated. And then in order to just like move past that moment, like, well, let's just have sex.
Yeah.
We'll just have sex in some way, push past this moment. And then it never solved anything.
Right.
The issue was always there still, but I like
that's
that you
the difference.
That
yeah. That's the difference, I think, between sex used to numb and distract versus sex really used to heal. Because makeup sex can be wonderful if it is truly an experience to heal and reconnect. If it's to distract and trick yourself into thinking the fight is over, not so much.
The part two where you mentioned having other tools available, where if that's your only tool, if that's the only thing that you're using. And I think for a long time, especially in the beginning of our relationship, where we went through like that honeymoon phase where everything was wonderful and great and we were having great, amazing sex all the time, then just constantly going back to that, almost like back to that source of connection, but also that was like the thing that we were using. That was like the hammer that we used all the time, regardless, right? Even though it's like we needed a whole bunch of other tools.
Right. It can't be the only thing.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's a really good hammer.
It can be a great hammer. Hammer away. There's so many puns in sex.
What are some of the biggest issues that you see? Because I think the other thing that we've had to really learn about is we have a different, not just a different understanding of what sex is, but like what sex is in a relationship. So what are some of the biggest things that couples struggle with? Because it is like, it's a tough topic to discuss. It's a tough topic to navigate. Do you know what I mean? Eventually you learn like you're sexually compatible, but that doesn't necessarily mean that that's going to sustain you over the course of your relationship. So you have to learn how to communicate all of these different things.
Yeah.
What are some of the big areas that couples get stuck in?
Well, I think in terms of getting stuck, that's like what the adaptability chapter in the book is that's what it's all about. It's about, how to maintain a sexual growth mentality and recognize that, the sex you have in the early days is going to be different than, after the honeymoon wears off. It's going to change again when you're trying to conceive, when you have young children at home, when you can't rely on the position you were used to because now the hip is arthritic. Like, you have to be able to navigate the hurdles that inevitably come with life. And I think that chapter in particular speaks a lot about how to kind of maintain a good quality sex life. Because I guess to answer your question, what a lot of couples come in to see me with is desire for sex has gone down. And of course, like I said in the beginning, there can be a million different reasons why that is. But let's say we've ruled out major relationship dysfunction or trauma or, the obvious ones. Sometimes it's because one partner has maybe failed to adapt the other's evolving needs. it can be as simple as that. And they adopt that sort of set it and forget it mentality that really inhibits growing together as a couple sexually. I see this, I would say perhaps most profoundly, in women who are in the postpartum period, done having babies. There's just so much that changes with the female body through that season of life. And then again, through menopause. And so sometimes, and I'm talking primarily, about heterosexual couples, because that's the majority of what I treat. But, there can be kind of a failure to adapt to some of those changes. And it may be because one person just doesn't know how to communicate what they need or why they may need something done differently. And other times it's because the other person just really fails to listen and make change. And so it can start to put couples into this dynamic of like my sexual needs versus his sexual needs, or, his versus hers, or whatever it may be. Versus viewing sex as this kind of ongoing collaborative partnership that, you're both on the same team, and have to play equal parts in creating, and this is where I fall back on like what we know about group flow. We see this like, I think the best example is in a group of musicians or in a team sport. Like they're all very clear on what the goal is. It's to create a beautiful musical piece or to win the game. Like everyone is on the same page about what the goals are. But for some reason, when it comes to sex, we very quickly kind of we dissect like what my need versus their need is. And it can feel like two opposing forces. And just to elaborate a bit more on the goal comment, 99% of sex therapists will tell you not to have goal-oriented sex. And I am very heretical in my opinion that actually setting goals can be a really great way to reconnect sexually, because then it's something you're working towards together. So I don't know if that was kind of a long-winded way of answering your question, but I hope I touched on it.
No, you did for sure. Yeah. What were some of the things, babe, that you had that you wanted to ask?
So much. But first, one of the ones that you went into, and I'm hoping you will dive into that as well, just to kind of go off of the goal setting, is how sometimes couples will struggle with not wanting to plan sex, wanting it to be spontaneous. And and I felt that too. I'm like, well, if we're planning it, then it's pressure. It's, it's taking away. But you described it really, really neat on how, like at the beginning, that's exactly what you're doing. Would you mind going into that a little bit? Because it was
for sure. Yeah. Now this is a point that I am aligned with 99% of sex therapists, because one of the biggest myths out there, which everybody in my field can agree on, is that sex is only good if it's spontaneous. Myth, lie, don't buy into it. Trying to fight it or prove that it's true is a complete waste of time. We know this from a lot of research, and we know this from our experience in the field. So yes, here's my spiel on planned sex. Number one is when you were dating, you were planning it. You just didn't call it that, but everyone knew what was going down at the end of the night, and you shaved the things and you got ready and you had the nice dinner together or whatever it may be. You put time and energy into connecting. You didn't say, hey, I'm planning to have sex with you, but everybody knew that that's what was going to happen. So you've always been planning it, just no longer feels planned. Or no longer feels, it felt spontaneous. It no longer feels spontaneous when you're also brushing your teeth together every single night. So that's number one. You've always been planning it. You just got to start shifting your mindset back to that reality and begin doing it again. Number two, and this is kind of it may seem silly to some people, but I just prefer the word planned over schedule. I just feel like you schedule a root canal, but you plan a party. Just has a more positive connotation to me. I'm a stickler for language. So my clients, there's a lot of words like my clients aren't allowed to use, and scheduled is one of them. So we plan sex, we don't schedule it. Number three, I encourage people to put it on the calendar more as a plan B, or a fallback plan, so that it's there. You have the time set aside if you don't connect at other times during the week or month, just however, whatever you decide, you need to kind of make sure you have that time set aside. So it's there as a fallback plan. Doesn't mean you're avoiding it until that time and date roll around. It just means that if you don't connect, let's say more organically at another time, you've got that time set aside, and you've chosen to set aside that time because you both prioritize it. You both see it as something that is important for your relationship. The other thing I say is that, you can always change your plans.
Today's episode of the podcast is brought to you by Heritage Still. A few years back, after we learned all about the toxic chemicals in those nonstick pans, we decided to toss them out and go with 100% stainless steel cookware from Heritage Still.
Heritage Still uses high-quality, multi-clad stainless steel to give you unmatched durability, precision, and performance.
Their cookware is safe for any cooking surface. It's easy to clean, and every piece of cookware comes with a lifetime warranty. So whether you're a pro in the kitchen or just learning your way around, Heritage Still makes cooking easier, more precise, and more enjoyable.
Right now, listeners of the podcast can save 10% off anything at Heritage Still. Head over to heritagestill.us/Steph Craig and be sure to enter promo code Steph Craig at checkout to save 10%.
Invest in cookware that lasts a lifetime. Heritage Still, chef-grade cookware for less.
No one's holding your feet to the fire. If that time comes around and you have had the day from hell, or you or your husband or wife or whoever's pissed you off, like, you don't have to do it. Okay. You can always try again the next day and reschedule. You also don't have to have like full-blown intercourse every time that time comes around. In fact, I try to move people away from seeing sex as something that has like a beginning, middle, and end. So as long as you are connecting physically, sensually, in some way without any distractions, and so have some kind of skin-to-skin contact, I'm good with that. And then finally, hang on, I have another point about this. Just because you plan when doesn't mean you have to plan what. So there can still be an element of, let's say, spontaneity thrown in to that time you have together. So yes, plan sex, 10 out of 10, highly recommend.
Love the reframe of that, just because of the realizing that when you started off in the beginning, that was all planned. That just took the stance that may have been in your brain of like, we can't plan it. It has to be spontaneous.
I wasn't planning anything.
Yeah. I had no expectations.
Just dinner and a movie, babe. I don't know what you're talking about.
I always am just like all the prep work just for dinner. For dinner. So yeah, I also wasn't planning anything. But
I have a friend in Austin. Her podcast is called "Did I Shave My Vag for This?" I think it's just so funny because like all the preparation that women go to only if something doesn't happen, and how disappointing that can be. So yeah, you were preparing.
Right? It's gonna be prickly tomorrow. So like, here we go.
Take advantage. Yes.
It brings the fun back to planning too. Instead of it feeling like mundane, it's like you said, plan a party. It really, the fun of it came back. I never once considered scheduling it. And it's because that was the mindset. Right. But now I'm really thinking about planning it.
Oh my gosh. It's like the world is your oyster. You can, I heard this thing on this podcast I was listening to or read about in this magazine, and I'd really love to try it with you, but I gotta, do some prep work to think about how to implement that. And I'd love to talk to you about it first and kind of get your 2 cents. And then do you think like Saturday night would be a good time to like try the thing? Like now I'm excited about it. It's a total shift in mindset.
I love it. There's, because sometimes when we find ourselves, and just to kind of like backtrack a little bit, sometimes when we find ourselves in patterns or ruts or however you may come up, like dealing with something that is like a new experience. Like I felt like I really identified with being a sensual person. Mm-hmm. It was very, very sensual. Not only did I really like that about me, but in my brain that gave me worth. I'm a good wife. I'm a good partner. I'm a good, all the attachments that came to it. And I understand how unhealthy it is to attach all that, but that's what it built up to. And then as I began to unpack a lot of these things, and therapy is really helpful. You know, everybody just like had so much work had to go into this and finding like my center in that space. And then like the shifting again, you talk about the adaptability. And sometimes it's not with your partner. Sometimes it's with yourself. You have to figure out how are you going to like, what's happening with me now? How do I get used to this new phase?
Mm-hmm.
And there's also like this mindset, the things that I really took away, and it's to slow it down when things can feel impossible. Cause we're super excited right now. We're super excited about the planning and we're talking about it, and we're able to have these really open communications. And they're not always like, sometimes having these communications, as you mentioned, just even being able to look in your partner in their eyes during sex,
Mm-hmm.
and at times is it's a big leap. And so I was looking at it from these big leap parts of how do we start with these little baby steps, and
Yeah.
your presence and understanding, like you broke it down so well about like you can't go run a marathon if all you've done is gone to the mailbox. And it's so
Right.
much throughout the day. There's so much distraction. We're doing so many different things. Like are we I think at one point you're like, when you're exercising, you know, are you filling your body? Are you doing other things? I'm on it reading your book. And I'm like, well,
I know.
I'm on the
Hey,
treadmill reading your book.
I'll give you a pass if it's for my book, but
Right? All is
yeah.
acceptable. But it brought so much clarity into my space of like, we can't be distracted all day and have all of these different things and having to be here and here and here. And then get to the space where you're with your partner and you're ready to connect sexually, and then be like, okay, brain, you can
Right.
relax now. Now we
Yeah.
can be present.
Right. It's not
And
just a
that,
decision you
so
make.
yeah. So I started
Yeah.
with presence, with just your
Mhm.
awareness of that. That day, I'm like, I'm going to be present in everything that I'm doing, just
So you
everything. And
tried it.
of course, I tried it day
Okay, tell
one.
me, tell me.
It immediately, because it was slowing me down. And it's like a presence. We hear all the time, be present, you know, you're not, don't shit all over yourself by, you know, what about the past or the future? And then you're like connected it to sex. I'm like, oh, if I can be present more, then I can be more present with more connected sex. So suddenly I had another invested interest with the presence.
Yeah.
So I slowed down. I really slowed down, and I kept bringing awareness to it, whether I was looking at the grass, whether I was washing dishes, whether I was throwing a load of laundry in, whether I was taking a shower, all of these different things that those only, you know, I know we're very busy people, but I practice, and it wasn't present all day. I practice in moments. I practice
Yeah, you
dropping
do
in.
it where you can.
And then that night, it was so much easier for me to drop in and be present. And I was like really bringing the sensuality. I was feeling the temperature of his skin. I was feeling like the way that his cheek was on my, like I had so much focus that I could pull into that space. And it was amazing. Day
I have
one, I
like
was like
head to
just those
toe
tiny.
chills right now. This is so, I mean, this is what I did it for. You know, I don't think I've been on a podcast where someone has actually said, I did this thing. Like I've had people who've read the book, but for someone to be open about, hey, I tried this exercise and it worked in a really meaningful way. Like, thank you so much for sharing that and for your candor. It's just really nice to hear.
It was nice to experience. I'm glad you like
Yeah.
that.
Yeah, but you know, it's like all of these the five qualities that I write in the book, we are born with. Okay? So this is not a matter of becoming someone you're not or stepping too far outside your comfort zone. It is reconnecting with qualities that are already there within all of you. You know, we are born sensual, we are born curious, we are born, you know, with the ability to adapt, to be vulnerable, and to attune. Like our brains and bodies are designed for this. But life, you know, especially modern day life, I think has really disconnected us from these innate qualities. So it's a matter of recognizing the way each chapter is laid out as I identify the thing that I think has really severed the tie with that quality. And then I try to explain how to reconnect with it. You know, babies, small children, they experience the world in and through the senses, solely in and through the senses, especially before they have the use of language. And up until sometimes you're like, why are you still putting things in your mouth? But it's because they got to taste it, right? It's like, that's just how they make sense and understand the world at a deeper level. But this day and age, with the pace at which we live our lives and the degree to which we fill our calendar and the ability we have now to do 2 or 3 things at once. It's like when we're having lunch, we're checking emails. When we're walking on the treadmill, we're listening to a podcast. When we're in the car, we're calling our mom. Like we're always doing 2 things at once. And to your point, what I write about in this chapter is that, yeah, you cannot expect to go from split attention all day long to a fully embodied presence, singular focused sexual experience just like that. The brain just doesn't work that way. And so as much as possible, yeah, I mean, you said it, the things that you're doing is what I write about. I want people to, when they're out for a walk, just to feel the sun on their face and notice the way the wind moves the leaves in the tree. And this is something my research participants talked about. I had people talk about, like, I need texture. I need a fluffy blanket. I need gauzy curtains. I need to pet my cat. Like, when I love taking bubble baths and lighting my scented candle, like, these were very sensual people. Like, that experience with sensuality was very much a part of their lives. And I think, women in particular really struggle to quiet the mind because, they're the ones, for the most part, who have the mental load and the never ending to-do list. And, does my kid have the backpack ready for tomorrow? Have I finalized everything I need for that project that's due? Did I remember to call my sister back? Like, whatever it is that's floating in there can make it really hard to get in touch with the body. And I love what you said about focus, how it made it easier to focus, because there's a saying in flow state science, which is that flow follows focus. You have to get into a focused state if you're going to get into flow. You can't get into flow if you don't have focus. And so I encourage people to really think about what they need to do, within themselves, with their partner, and especially within their environment to set the stage to make it easier to get into a focused state. And, while I'm talking about that, I think it's a good time to mention the stages of flow. So flow doesn't have an on and off switch. It actually starts with something referred to as the struggle phase. Think about the surfer who has to paddle out and just kind of wait around for the right wave, or the artist who has to spend time mixing the oils, or the musician who has to tune the instrument. Like, they don't just get into flow the second they hop on the board, pull out the canvas, or, pull the cover off the piano. There's a struggle period. There's kind of a working towards that happens. And during that period of time, your body floods with stress hormones, which is what I think turns a lot of people off during sex, because they worry right out of the gates that they're not going to be able to relax. I'm not going to be able to focus. All those intrusive thoughts come in. And so they kind of just accept that, rather than giving themselves time and space to move through the stages. And so once the struggle phase starts to shift, we enter into the release phase. And that's when the body starts to relax, the cortisol floods out, attention begins to narrow, and only then do we experience flow. I think a lot of people don't even have sex long enough to move through the stages. And so, yeah, I think it would behoove people to try to slow down, not just in their day-to-day lives, but in the bedroom as well.
Could you speak more to that right there at the end there, where, people don't have sex long enough? I know that comparing it to the flow state and using that as an example of looking at those stages that you just got done describing, like that beginning phase where you're preparing and it's kind of stressful and there's some work involved in it. Oftentimes when we're, preparing to have sex, when we're getting into the mood, it is a lot of like taking care of shit. And like, suddenly it's all the different things that we have to suddenly take care of in that moment in order to get into that spot. And then because it feels like that took up too much time, then we have to hurry up and rush this experience because the whole thing is taking up too much time anyways. Or do you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
I just want to, like, there was something there that I'm like, I would like speak more to that if you would. I don't even know if I have a question there, but it's like, it feels like people aren't allowing themselves enough time to really like, what would be, I mean, because if I think about it, I mean, we can get into the flow state, within the scope of like 10 or 15 minutes. And then we're in that space where time does disappear and it doesn't really matter what happens afterwards and everything's
Mhm.
great and everything's fine. Do you know what I mean? But
Yeah.
getting over that initial hump, I think, is so important. And again, I've never thought about it in the context the way that you're describing it. So I'm just loving that.
Yeah, sure. So
Today's episode of the podcast is brought to you by Nutrotonic. I've been a big fan of Shilajit for a really long time, but I've really struggled to find a brand that prioritizes quality above all else. Most of what's out there is really low quality, diluted, and packed with unnatural fillers, but not Nutrotonic's Shilajit. Nutrotonic's Shilajit is a rare form of red Himalayan Shilajit. It's packed with all the essential minerals, fulvic acid, and nutrients that your body needs. Shilajit's going to help you boost your energy, your focus, and your overall health and well-being. Nutrotonic Shilajit is the real deal. It's sourced directly from the high-altitude regions of the Himalayas. Listeners of the Steph Craig Show can save 15% off of everything at Nutrotonic's website. Click the link in the description and be sure to use code StephenCraig to save that 15% off. Power up and fuel your body the way nature intended with Nutrotonic's Shilajit.
I think, I don't want people to listen to this and think that every star has to be aligned in order for flow state to happen, because when is that ever going to be the case? I mean, we're busy, we got kids, we got work, we got a load of laundry. Like there's always going to be something. So it's more about, it's remembering that shit you're saying we got to take care of, it's always going to be there. So sometimes it's a matter of deciding to just let it lie where it is while you take this time out to focus on each other, and then you can pick back up. Because if you're of the mind that you have to cross everything off your list in order to have sex, like you will never have sex, because whoever finishes everything on their to-do list before adding something else to it, like that's just not the world we live in. So I think that's why I focus less on kind of clearing your plate in order to have sex, and more on, doing one thing at a time and single tasking as much as possible within reason. And when you're doing whatever it is that you're doing throughout the day, to really focus on it and to be present on it from an embodied sensual experience, so that transition is easier when the time ultimately does come to connect. I don't know if you guys saw that series I think it was just called The Affair or Affair. I think it was an HBO series. It was an old one, but there was this line that I'll never forget. It was an older lady. It was this couple who was having an affair, and I can't remember the exact context, but what the line was, she was like, I see these young people twisting their bodies up on yoga mats when they should be twisting their bodies up with their lover, and I really do think there is too much of an emphasis on all this quote unquote self-care, the things we need to do to keep ourself healthy. And I think we would get so much more benefit if we viewed that more from a relational lens. Like, what can I do with my partner? Because I will tell you, you are not going to feel better, investing $5,000 on a silent meditation retreat. Not that there's not a place for that kind of thing. But I feel like we've moved away from relational, sensual beings to very, for lack of a better word, kind of, it's like we've become selfish in the name of self-care. And I think, there's so much benefit that we get from a positive, meaningful sexual experience, probably more so than we would get from a yoga class or paying someone to give us a great massage, but I think a lot of people, again, women, tend to view sex as something they're doing for a man, as opposed to something that they can get something out of themselves. There's sort of an unlearning that has to happen. And I write about that piece in the curiosity chapter, I think, to shift our mindset and understanding about the potential that exist within a great sexual experience.
One of the things that's been coming up a lot for us lately, and it's something that, because oftentimes we'll have all of these things that we've been doing over the course of our relationship in some regards, right? But then we get them reflected back to us, whether we see something or hear something. And we'll both do this where we'll kind of go back and forth with stuff. But lately, the thing that's been really coming up for us is co-regulation, and how massively important co-regulation is. And we did this episode not long ago. And the more that I thought about it and the more that I processed it, I was looking at it really from the lens of like, not just something that we have the capacity to do, but something that we need to do. Like it's how we are supposed to be regulating is with each other, not necessarily like you were saying, like the benefit of, self-love and self-care and taking the time for yourself has its place and it's massively important. But being able to like not necessarily expedite, but the richness and the fullness of being able to not just co-regulate with another person and co-regulate with your partner, but like you said, just, I mean, I can attest to that. I think that a big chunk of Steph and I's journey has been kind of healing together and processing together and moving things together. And I don't think we would have ever gotten to the depth that we've been able to had we not done that work together.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
not just obviously under the lens of like sex and everything like that, but all of these kind of different things. It's massively, massively important. I mean, it's the same thing where you can't expect somebody to, like two people come together and the strength of your relationship is really dependent upon, yes, on how much work you're doing individually. And that's massively important. But at the same time, like you have to at some point bring that work together and do that work together as well if you want the relationship to be strong.
That's absolutely right. And I really try to move people away from this idea that you have to heal yourself before getting into a healthy relationship. Like all you're going to notice is your stuff comes back up as soon as you're in relation with another person, because humans are relational. We're not individual, we're social. And to your point about co-regulation, I write a lot about that in the attunement chapter. Bridget Feinhart has really great research on physiological synchrony within couples, looking at, she'll have couples sit across from each other with, all the monitors on their heart rate and respiration and perspiration and all that stuff. And, has found that the more quickly a couple's nervous system syncs up, the higher they report their sexual satisfaction being, versus couples who are just a bit more discombobulated when it comes to that type of attunement and synchrony. And, it's not rocket science. It's like just sitting across and being very intentional and having, say 5 minutes a day where you're taking your partner's hand in yours and looking in their eyes and having a conversation about the day without any other distraction can be enough to start making those nervous systems sync up a bit more. One thing that I found to be really interesting in her research is that she found that women's nervous systems tend to follow their male partners. In other words, that male partners tend to set the tone. And so I think that can be really important to kind of keep in mind when you're trying to improve the quality of your sex life. And there's a lot of different reasons this may be. I mean, probably the most obvious one is that women are just socialized to adjust probably a bit more to the world around them than men are. But I think that, if men can remember that the way that their level of energy is when they're around their partner, that there's a lot they can do to help their partner's nervous system calm down and relax enough to then allow arousal to build. And I don't think that's something that men do enough of. I think they're, quick to jump up behind their partner while she's, cooking dinner and grab her ass. And that's not going to regulate. It's going to annoy 99% of the time. I mean, unless it's playful and everyone's on board with it. But, I think we need to know that there's a grounding. I was on this other podcast the other day, and Whitney is her first name. I'm totally blanking on her last name, but she said something about how foreplay should sometimes be thought more of as grounding than it should as arousing, because arousal will happen in and through the grounding. And I was like, yes, that's exactly what I'm trying to articulate. But you said it in a way, in a way that really, I think, makes a lot more sense. So yeah, I think as it relates to co-regulation and grounding and physiological synchrony, it's very powerful and actually pretty simple.
I love that. That's a really good perspective shift. It's going in for the foreplay is for grounding, not arousal. The arousal will happen. Because so much of it is
great.
like, that's really great.
Yeah.
That's really great.
What we can learn from lesbians. That was because her whole thing is like queer and lesbian. And there is so much that heterosexual couples can learn from the queer community, from the kink community, because, I think because they are more outside their traditional box, there's already a growth mindset at play and kind of a necessity to adapt and adopt and figure things out. That a lot of, your standard heterosexual couple just hasn't really had to do. So I loved that.
Yeah.
I want to ask you, because we're talking about all of these things, which I very much agree with. I'm on the same page with. It's stuff that I've had to learn how to tap into and connect to, and all the slowing down process, the being present process, the being able to have a sensual connection with Stephanie and being able to incorporate that into our relationship, and not just in context of sex, but outside of it and everything like that. Sometimes I think that I don't have a, like, men suck. Men are just really struggling across the board. But I think that, I don't know if that's really the case, or if that's the thing that we're constantly still always being portrayed, and that it's always being, what I mean? Like, when it comes to these things, men have a very, like you said, like they're sitting there cooking dinner and they come up and behind and they grab their ass, and that's funny. Right. And that's their way of foreplay. That's their way. And the truth of it is, like, there's such a huge spectrum when it comes to sex and connected sex. And sometimes that type of energy is great and everybody likes that, obviously, if it's consensual and everything like that. But the deeper thing that you're talking about, and that the book's about, and that we've been talking about this whole entire episode, like, from your experience, does it really seem like men are showing up for it? Or is it still this big hurdle that wives are bringing their men to therapy, and they're trying to get their men to change, and they're trying to get them to see it differently, and men are still struggling and still just wanting sex and not seeing what the big deal is? And you know what I mean? I don't know the reality of it, because I only have, obviously, our relationship and kind of like a small little group of people that, I kind of talk to and connect to. But I would like to think that in the broader sense, that men as a whole are changing and evolving and are much more open. And honestly, like, looking at this too from the perspective of, it's not just about sex. Like, the fact is, at the end of the day, when we have great sex, it's because our relationship is so wonderfully connected. And it's just it's a thing that is, it's the icing on the cake of our relationship. It's not our relationship is great and now we get to have sex. It's our relationship is great. Yeah. I just, like,
is
it
a
breaks
part
my
of
heart
that. Yeah.
sometimes to think about.
I don't think men suck. I think men are wonderful and have so much to offer and bring relationships. I think gender socialization sucks, and I think the patriarchy sucks. And I think, I have a son and a daughter. And I mean, my little boy is the most sensitive. I mean, he is pure honey. And I'm like, I am going to do different than previous generations have done to make sure that you don't lose this part of yourself. Because I think anyone who has a little boy can see that. They, like, all children are sweet and sensitive, but you just see how socialization inhibits and really cuts them off from this really sweet, sensitive side. And so I think, again, it's in there. To your question about, what am I seeing? And are wives still bringing their husbands into therapy? There's such a generational difference. There's a lot more unlearning that has to happen for, millennials and above, I would say, than is happening for Gen Z and below, just because of where we are societally and historically, as it relates to our understanding of kind of men and women and what's innate versus what's socialized, and how does vulnerability fit in? Does that mean I have to be there? I saw this post the other day talking about the difference between being emotional and being vulnerable. And the woman was saying, we don't need men to be like super emotional, but we do need them to be vulnerable. And there's a difference, and that's okay. It's not like we want this range of emotional up and downs, but to be able to say, hey, I have this fear, or for a woman to say, hey, I've got this thing going on, to feel like their male partner is there for them in a really kind of protective way. I mean, you can still hold on to like your masculine energy or your feminine energy, but also tap into maybe your more latent side. So I write about this in the book too, like the anima and animus. And if you don't like the gender loaded language here, you can think of it more as like assertive sides versus receptive sides. We all have both sides, but I think because of the influence of gender socialization and cultural norms, we really suppress one part of that side. And I think women are ahead of men in terms of opening up both sides, and men are a bit behind the game and kind of tapping into their more latent sides. So it's not about like becoming more or less masculine or feminine or neutralizing gender, I don't think, but it's really about tapping into all parts of ourselves to be a more whole person. And when we can show up to the bedroom as a more whole person, as opposed to just a part of ourselves, we have a lot more to offer.
Yeah. Yeah. I have hope for men. I have hope for us.
So do I. I mean, I love what, I've heard you share just about the work you've put in and the journey and, the learning and healing. I mean, there are men, I think, who are really vested in doing better and being better and showing up in a more meaningful way. And so I have hope too. I really do.
What else, babe?
There's so much that we didn't get to get to.
Such a big topic.
There is so much that I was so excited to talk to you about. I think I was talking so fast in the beginning. I'm like trying to like pack it all in, but just can't recommend your book enough. This has been such insightful. Like, even this conversation is so opening. You're zoning in as opposed to zoning out. Just that little shift, even right there, it's bringing me to, like, we won't go off on this, but just like, even it comes into fantasy to when you're fantasizing with your partner. And, I've definitely had this, it was something that we did a lot, and we had a lot of this space, and somehow I've attached where I'm disconnecting, I'm zoning out. This isn't, and I was like, actually, no, that was a complete zone in. I was very present. We were very there together. Yeah. And just having the awareness of that has healed a little piece of me that I didn't, you know what I mean? There's just like this extra little window now that just opened up that I get to go explore with all of this new curiosity that comes in. And I love the curiosity of it. I love the exploration of it. And, there's still things to level out, but the perspective shift, the opening up, it's not necessarily zoning out. You might be zoning in. Let's get clear on what's happening in this space. And so I'm very excited. I love that there's so many exercises you have in your book that I'm excited to go back to, and even later on, because your answers change when you're
yes. So I'm too type A to write a book without any exercises in it. It couldn't be like purely descriptive. But to your point, I wanted this book, I wanted to write it in a way to where it could live on people's bookshelves as a resource to pull out from time to time, because your answers will change. It's like, if you're the couple who is busy passing like 2 ships in the night because of work and kids, like, just focus on the sensuality chapter. Like, that's going to help you Marie Kondo your sex life and just really get, that strong foundation. If you're the couple who feels like sex has become kind of boring and monotonous and predictable, like, just maybe focus on the curiosity chapter. If you're struggling to circumvent a hurdle or an obstacle in your relationship, or there's a life adjustment thing, then the adaptability chapter is what would be worth taking a look at. You know, if you feel like there's an emotional block, either personally or relationally, then that's what the vulnerability chapter is all about. So there's really, I think, something for everybody, depending on what the issue is and what season of life you're in. And my hope was that it could kind of serve as an ongoing, you know, resource for people.
Go get your copy now. And whether you get a hard copy or an Audible version, you have a ton of freebies with it. You're offering so much with the book. Will you talk about those?
I do. Yeah. Yes. So if you go to my website, which is emilyjamea.com, I have like tons of free bonuses available with book purchase. So you just click Anatomy of Desire. There's an online form you fill out where you can put your proof of purchase, and then you'll get like access to my masterclass, which includes, you know, video lessons plus all the exercises that didn't make the cut into the book. You get things like an intimacy discussion deck, which is a deck of 52 cards with intimacy prompts. You get the 30-day intimacy challenge. Like there's just tons of goodies on there. So go check it out. And of course, if you do get the book and you love it, Amazon reviews always help. So I would be so grateful. And yeah, I'm accessible. I'm on all the social medias at Dr. Emily Jamea. So be sure to follow and I'm around.
As well as your podcast.
Yeah, the podcast.
Oh,
it's
yeah,
Love and
my
Libido,
podcast.
right?
Yeah. Yes, if you're a podcaster, thank you. Check that out too. It's called Love and Libido.
We'll be sure to share it all down in the show notes and everything like that, so it's easy for people to find.
Awesome.
And thank you again. Like this has been just so wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you. The pleasure was all mine. Y'all made it easy.
Okay.
Expect the best.
Plan for the greatest.
Got a wild ride. Wait and see, you and me. We were meant to be.
Thanks for tuning into the episode. If you haven't yet, please take a moment and subscribe, rate, review, and share this episode with somebody. There's new episodes of the Steph Craig Show every week. And if you enjoyed this one, be sure to check out some of these clips as well. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you all on the next episode.